Good Wednesday morning to you. As we get ready for Advent, as we continue to do our preparation to receive Jesus in a new way, I want to take a little bit of a pause today and talk about something that we never talk about because it's not in our traditional Bibles that we think of, and that's the Apocrypha. So in my Bible, I have a study Bible, and if you have a study Bible, or maybe you came from a Catholic or Eastern Orthodox tradition, you have a section in the middle of your Bible that looks like this. And it's a pretty small section. It's called the Apocrypha. The reason that not all Bibles hold the Apocrypha is because widely in Christianity, not everyone accepts them. The Apocrypha, some of the letters were found later than when the canon was open, and some of them could not be authenticated the way the councils at the time wanted them to be just commended to the canon. So what the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches did is they created a deuteral canon that's in addition to the canon, a side by side, and they kind of put it right between the Old Testament and the New Testament. We never read out of the Apocrypha in our tradition, but historically it has a lot of really interesting details that, as my study Bible has, and you'll notice my study Bible's pretty worn, it really has value, and it's pretty significant to how we read what comes next. So today I want to pause and I want to talk about the Maccabean Revolt, because Jesus is born into a world that has very heavy political and religious tensions. And we know that right from the beginning. We know the story of the Magi, right? Jesus is born, and then within 2 to 3 years, the Magi come. Some of us purists like to put the wise men around the corner of the nativity. Sometimes they're not always kept with the nativity because they actually come quite a while after Jesus' birth. But when they come, they stop and they talk with Herod first. And because of that interaction, Herod has all of the children, all of the male children in Israel slaughtered who are 2 years old and younger. The slaughtering of the innocents. And there's beautiful texts about Rachel weeping for her children, which echoes back to some of the Old Testament stories and narratives that we've already covered. But the Maccabean Revolt helps us to better understand why those tensions are happening. What's going on in the society where this has become the norm. So if you don't have the Apocrypha, not to worry, you can always Google it, Apocrypha. But let me just tell you a little history on the Maccabeans and why this is important to the story of Jesus. So we know that Alexander the Great is in power, right? This is a big deal because it has changed the shift of the Israelites in power and all of the nations, Babylon and all the nations around it. Alexander the Great dies in 332 BC, somewhere around that. When Alexander the Great becomes ruler, Greek becomes the primary language. So when we look ahead to Pilate and when he designates the different languages on the cross of Christ, he writes it in Hebrew for the Jewish people. He writes it in Greek for the Romans. He writes it in Aramaic for the countryside people. And he writes it in Latin for the very educated. Now, all of these languages are somewhat commonplace in a very small space. If you remember, Israel in the entirety is like the size of Rhode Island. And so you have these languages, and the languages really designated whether you were educated or not. It designated if you were a Jew or not. Hitler, he will define Jews by the size of their forehead, by the space between their eyes. But in this time and place, it was the language you spoke. It was the clothes that you wore. And so what happens is Alexander the Great dies, and it allows for other influences to come in. The Seleucids are the most prominent. These are the Syrians that come from the north. There's also a Ptolemaic that comes up from the south, but the Seleucids are the ones that are really dangerous for this culture. And so what happens is they come in and they take over Jerusalem and they profane the temple. If you have a study Bible that has the Apocrypha in this is First Maccabees. And Maccabee, it's called the Maccabean Revolt because there was a father with 5 sons, and it's how they managed this revolt against this new political order that came into the place. So as Alexander comes in, and then past his leadership, they take on this Hellenistic tradition, this Greek tradition. And so all of the things that we know from Greek mythology come and infuse and invade the religious perspectives. Really not unlike where we left off in our Can You Relate series with Jeroboam and just the temple prostitutes that they brought in and all of the different places to give offering to multiple gods. That's what's happening in the Maccabean Revolt. Well, this takes place for about 160 years, 150 years, generations. But what comes out of this revolt is the re-purification of the temple. And that's what's important for us because they hold fast to the temple. It is Jewish tradition at night to light a candle. They lit a candle and they didn't have enough oil. That's kind of the folklore that comes into the historical tradition. So they lit the candles. They didn't have enough oil. They prayed to the Almighty, to Yahweh, that Yahweh would protect them and would deliver them. And the menorah ends up lasting a total of 8 days. That's now the celebration of Hanukkah. And so they commemorate the cleansing of the temple, the fact that God was faithful and allowed them to overthrow their enemies, and then they celebrate this. And so the Hanukkah celebration actually just finished on Monday. Monday was the last day of Hanukkah. And sometimes the Hanukkah celebration and the Christmas celebration actually overlap. It has everything to do with the cycles of the moon, which is kind of a fascinating detail. But the reason it's important, the reason why it matters for us as Christians, is that Hanukkah was the rededication to turning to God. It was turning away from the powers of this world and turning to God, not having any guarantee that a life with God was going to be better than a life in this world, only by the matters of faith, that God would protect, God would persevere, God would present himself in a way that allowed the people to hold fast to the Almighty. Hanukkah, while it celebrates this moment and this time, it is the reminder that in our faith, we are always called to be in the world, not of the world. We're always called to push against what is wrong and unjust and to ground ourselves in what God is doing. We are called to open our eyes and see that the solutions of this world are often not the solutions that God would have for us. The Maccabean Revolt, what it does is it sets the foundation for all that's going to come with Jesus' birth. So the Jewish people are going to separate into 2 very separate and distinct, but incredibly orthodox groups. You're going to have the Pharisees and the Sadducees. That's going to be a result of the Maccabean Revolt. You're going to have zealots. Those are the extra Jewish people. These are the people that, like the Maccabean Revolt, were willing to give up their lives. And often the way they operated was like a spy within the people. One of Jesus's disciples is a zealot. You'll have to Google that and find that for yourself. Who is the zealot in Jesus' disciples, if you don't know? But the reality is this happens not even 200 years, 150 years before Jesus comes, and the effects and the ramifications of what this does for the people, how it sets up the political landscape. From this moment on, Rome is not going to put up with any kind of Jewish power. Rome, in fact, from this moment on, establishes an authority within the great city of Jerusalem that it never had before, to essentially keep watch over the Jewish people. And Herod's legacy and his ruthfulness for the people will become evident in how the people who serve underneath him, people like Pilate, keep peace within their certain districts. So it's because of the Maccabean Revolt that we won. We remember that the powers of this world are never the solution for us in our faith. And the powers of this world will often try to create our focus on it and not on God. It'll turn us away from God. And two, the Maccabean Revolt reminds us of the power of God's light shining in the darkness. This is John 1, the prologue that the gospel will introduce as Christ is born into the world. But it echoes the revolt that happened 150 years beforehand. God's light always shines in the darkness, and the darkness cannot overcome. Have a great Wednesday.